It was supposed to be just another routine flight, a trip across the country for a young pregnant woman about to meet her baby. But what happened on that plane would shake the passengers and crew to their core, leaving everyone in disbelief. Sarah had been counting down the days until she could finally relax. The past few months had been a whirlwind of doctor appointments, baby shopping, and moving across state lines. But now, as she boarded the plane, she had nothing but excitement and anticipation for her new life. However, she could never have expected the nightmare that awaited her on that flight. As she settled into her seat, her heart skipped a beat when a flight attendant, dressed in the airline's pristine uniform, walked over and gave her a judgmental look. Without any warning, the attendant demanded that Sarah leave her seat. What followed next was something that no one on that plane could have predicted, a sequence of events that would forever change the course of Sarah's life and leave everyone questioning their assumptions. What happens next will not only make you think twice about the assumptions we make about people, but will leave you questioning the true nature of justice and humanity. Stay tuned. Sarah Thompson wasn't just any pregnant woman on a plane. She had always been independent, hardworking, and determined. At 28, she had built a life for herself from the ground up, overcoming obstacles and challenges along the way. Her journey had never been easy, but she had never expected this part of it to be so painful. Originally from a small town in the South, Sarah had spent the past few years striving to build a career and a stable future for herself in a bigger city. She worked 2 jobs, dedicated hours to studying online courses, and endured many sleepless nights preparing for her baby. The past few months had been especially challenging as she navigated the reality of her pregnancy while juggling her career and personal life. Despite everything, Sarah was thrilled. She was excited about the new chapter in her life, about becoming a mother. But as she boarded the plane, heading from her new home to visit family for the first time since the pregnancy, she couldn't shake the nervous feeling that had been building in her chest. Was she ready for motherhood? Could she balance it all? Those were the questions racing through her mind when she found her seat. She tried to shake off the worries, reminding herself that everything would be okay. She was 7 months pregnant, still full of energy, but feeling every ounce of exhaustion her body had accumulated. As she buckled her seatbelt and relaxed back into the plush chair, she allowed herself a moment of peace. That was when she noticed the flight attendant. Jenna Parker worked as a flight attendant for nearly 6 years. She prided herself on her professionalism, her efficiency, and her ability to maintain control in any situation. But beneath her crisp uniform and poised demeanor, there were secrets she kept hidden from the world. Jenna had always lived by certain rules. Some she had learned from her upbringing, and others from the job itself. Born and raised in a privileged family in the suburbs, Jenna had always been taught to carry herself with a sense of superiority, one that came with privilege. It was something that had slowly seeped into her professional life, though she didn't like to admit it. She worked countless flights, serving food, answering questions, and trying to keep everyone happy. But there was something about Sarah that rubbed her the wrong way. Jenna didn't know why, but she could feel her own bias rising to the surface. Maybe it was the way Sarah looked, a young woman, obviously pregnant, with dark skin and a quiet demeanor. Something about her felt out of place to Jenna. That feeling had been simmering as Jenna walked down the aisle, checking on passengers. Sarah sat in her seat, quietly staring out of the window. It wasn't that Jenna hated her or wanted to cause trouble. She had no explanation for her behavior, but something in her mind told her that Sarah's place wasn't in that seat. It was something she didn't know how to explain, just a deep-seated discomfort she could never quite shake. The flight was typical. There was the usual bustle of passengers talking, reading, and eating their snacks. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower into the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the wing. There was an undeniable sense of routine in the air. But then everything changed. Jenna was making her way back down the aisle when she stopped at Sarah's seat. The words tumbled before she could think about them, each one fueled by a deep, unexplained sense of superiority. "You need to move," Jenna said, her voice cold. Sarah blinked, confused by the sudden interruption. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You heard me," Jenna replied, her tone unyielding. "You are not supposed to sit here. I'm going to have to ask you to move." Sarah felt a wave of shock rush over her, her heart pounding in her chest. Excuse me, you shouldn't sit here. There are other seats available, Jenna repeated, her eyes avoiding Sarah's. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced around the cabin. No one was looking her way. No one heard of the exchange. The weight of Jenna's words hung in the air. There was something deeply unsettling about the flight attendant's demand, the coldness in her voice. I'm pregnant. I need to sit here, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Jenna wasn't listening. You don't have a choice. Get up. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She didn't understand it. Was it just a misunderstanding? Was it the way she looked? Did she seem like she didn't belong? Without another word, Sarah stood up. The tension in the cabin grew thick as the flight attendant hovered by, arms crossed, eyes unwavering. Sarah tried to stay composed, but her chest was tight, and she felt her emotions starting to betray her. This wasn't just about a seat. This was something more, something deeply unsettling. She wasn't sure what to do or who to turn to, but she knew that she couldn't let this go. Not now, not ever. As Sarah stood, looking around at the other passengers, she saw a few eyes glancing over. They seemed indifferent, almost too focused on their activities to intervene. It was a moment of total isolation for Sarah. No one came to her aid. No one spoke up. The air seemed suffocating, as though the entire plane was a part of this injustice, this silent acceptance of the wrongdoing that had just occurred. Jenna remained stern, watching Sarah as she fumbled through her bag for a way to remedy the situation. Sarah wanted to argue, to scream, but her body froze. Was this how the world saw her now? As someone who wasn't worthy of respect because of her skin, because of her circumstances? But before Sarah could say another word, something unexpected happened. The captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual calm, routine announcement. This time it had an edge of urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. We have an issue with one of the passengers. Flight attendants, please come to the front immediately. At first there was confusion. Then everyone in the cabin turned to face the front. The flight attendants were all gathered in the aisle, whispering amongst themselves, while Jenna stood near Sarah's seat, clearly uncomfortable. It was as if a shift had happened in the cabin. The passengers were watching now. They were curious. And then, to everyone's surprise, an elderly woman stood up from a seat several rows away. She walked toward the front with an air of authority that caught the attention of everyone on board. Her eyes were cold, but her demeanor was calm and measured. She spoke directly to the flight attendants. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I know exactly what I saw. I've been flying for more years than most of you have been alive, and I've seen plenty of situations like this. I've seen this kind of discrimination before, and I won't stand by while it happens again. The elderly woman's words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the flight attendants. The tension shifted from Sarah and Jenna to the passengers, who now understood what had been unfolding. What happened next left everyone speechless. The elderly woman didn't just stand there and lecture, she acted. With authority and decisiveness, she addressed the entire cabin, her voice carrying to every corner of the plane. The passengers slowly stood up, some cautiously at first, others with clear purpose in their movements. At that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. She never had been. She was part of a larger community, one that was ready to stand up, even if it meant facing the uncomfortable truths about the world. Jenna, feeling the heat of the confrontation, turned red. But the captain's voice returned over the intercom, and his next words sealed the fate of what had been a deeply uncomfortable situation. As Sarah settled back into her seat, she realized that the events on the plane had taught her more than just the importance of standing up for herself. It had shown her that, no matter how many obstacles we face, there is always someone willing to help, to speak out, and to fight for what is right. It was a reminder that injustice, in whatever form, cannot go unchecked, and that we all have a role in creating the world we want to see. In the end, Sarah's strength was not only in standing up for herself, but in recognizing the power of collective action, the power of humanity. What had started as a humiliating experience had been transformed into something far more profound, a lesson in the importance of unity, solidarity, and respect for one another. And for Jenna, she had learned something too. Sometimes our biases are the greatest enemies we face. But if we are willing to confront them, if we are willing to listen, there is always room for growth, change, and understanding. As Sarah stood in the aisle, her eyes locked with the flight attendants, a sense of disbelief washed over her. The last thing she had expected when boarding that plane was to be humiliated in front of a packed cabin. She had tried to shake off her nerves during the entire boarding process. Pregnancy wasn't easy, especially at 7 months, but she was just a woman trying to get home. Now the words the flight attendant had just spoken echoed in her mind. "You need to move," Jenna had said. Sarah's fingers tightened around the armrest of the seat as she struggled to maintain composure. She had been on dozens of flights, but this was different. She had never experienced anything like this before. Was it because of her pregnancy? Or was it something deeper, something more insidious? The question churned in her mind, but she didn't have an answer. Her gaze flicked to the other passengers, but no one seemed to be paying attention. It was as though they were all wrapped up in their worlds, oblivious to the tension building right in front of them. Some passengers were listening to music, some were reading, and a few were lost in their phones. The few people who did glance at her quickly turned their heads, avoiding confrontation. This was not what Sarah had imagined her flight would be like. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the aisle. This is a matter of seat allocation." Jenna's voice was cold, almost mechanical. Sarah's heart raced. She had heard stories of discriminatory behavior, but she never thought it would happen to her. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words felt caught in her throat. How could she even explain what was happening? No one had come to her defense. No one had questioned Jenna's actions. "Look, I'm pregnant," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fear. "I can't just stand here. I need to sit." The implication was clear. Sarah didn't belong in that seat, didn't deserve it, as though her existence was somehow a problem. It hit Sarah hard. She had fought for everything she had in her life and worked tirelessly to make a place for herself. But at this moment, everything felt fragile, as though she was being stripped of the dignity she had worked so hard to preserve. Sarah's hand instinctively rested on her growing belly, her baby bump reminding her that this wasn't just about her. She was carrying a child, a new life. The thought filled her with warmth, but also a deep sense of vulnerability. The realization that she was being forced into this position, being judged and scrutinized for something beyond her control, began to sink in. What was Jenna's motivation? Was it just about the seat, or was it something else, something more personal? As Sarah took a deep breath, her thoughts were interrupted by a man from the row behind her. He had been listening to the exchange, and when he saw Sarah standing awkwardly in the aisle, his eyes softened. "Is everything all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Sarah turned toward the man, grateful for the first shred of kindness she had received since this nightmare began. He wasn't a young man, perhaps in his early 50s, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. He had the look of someone who had seen a lot in life, someone who understood hardship. I don't know what's happening," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "She's telling me to leave my seat. I can't. I'm pregnant." The man's face softened further, and without hesitation, he stood up, positioning himself between Sarah and the flight attendant. His actions were swift, his body language protective. He addressed Jenna directly. "Excuse me, miss. I think you're making a mistake here. This woman is pregnant. She needs to sit down. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should go speak to the captain," he said firmly, his voice steady but forceful. Jenna's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered as the man's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. Sarah could see that in the way he stood his ground, facing off with Jenna, who now seemed uncertain. Jenna looked over at the rest of the passengers, but no one moved. It was as though the entire cabin was silently observing, waiting to see how this would unfold. Sarah's mind raced. The man's sudden intervention had thrown Jenna off balance. She was used to being the authority on the plane, but now she was being challenged, and something in her shifted. As the flight continued, Sarah's thoughts began to shift. She had spent much of the flight worrying about the encounter, replaying the moments in her head. But now, as the plane cruised smoothly, as Jenna hesitated, Sarah could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but there was also something else. Defensiveness. The flight attendant took a step back, muttering something under her breath. "I'll go speak to the captain." She turned abruptly and walked toward the front of the plane. Sarah remained standing in the aisle, still reeling from the moment. She was shaken, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The elderly man who had stepped in to defend her turned toward her with a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" he asked. I I don't know," Sarah replied, feeling tears well up in her eyes. I just, I can't believe this is happening." The man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. Just breathe. You're not alone." At that moment, Sarah felt a sense of gratitude toward this stranger who had stepped in when no one else had. She could feel the weight of the situation lifting slightly. Maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world. As Jenna returned to the cabin, the passengers' eyes were now on her. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. She walked past Sarah and the man, her face a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Without saying another word, Jenna returned to her station at the front of the plane. The overhead announcement came soon after. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, firm and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have an issue with one of the passengers that needs to be addressed immediately. Please remain seated, and we will resolve this matter as soon as possible." Sarah felt her heart race again. What would happen now? She had done nothing wrong. She was simply a pregnant woman trying to travel home. But the uncertainty of the moment threatened to swallow her whole. Was she going to be removed from the plane? Would she be subjected to even more humiliation? The minutes seemed to drag on as the passengers anxiously waited for any further instructions. Sarah remained in the aisle, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The elderly man who had intervened earlier returned to his seat, but not before offering Sarah one last reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he whispered. "Things will be all right. I'm sure of it." And just as Sarah was about to turn back to her seat, the door to the cockpit opened, and the captain stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Sarah and Jenna. The flight attendant immediately stiffened, her posture rigid. She knew what was coming. The captain's gaze softened as he addressed Sarah. "Ma'am, I understand there has been a misunderstanding. This flight attendant has been spoken to, and I apologize for the inconvenience. You are free to stay in your seat for the remainder of the flight. Thank you for your patience." The tension in the cabin immediately melted away. The weight that had been pressing down on Sarah's chest for the last several minutes seemed to lift. She could finally breathe again. Jenna, visibly flustered, avoided Sarah's gaze as the captain turned to address the rest of the cabin. "Thank you all for your cooperation," the captain said, his tone calm. "We will proceed with the flight as planned." As the flight continued its course, Sarah returned to her seat, trying to process everything that had just happened. She was still shaken, but there was a sense of relief. The ordeal had left her physically exhausted, but emotionally drained as well. She had expected a peaceful flight, a chance to reconnect with her family, but instead she had been forced to confront a harsh reality about how quickly someone could be judged based on their appearance. But Sarah wasn't the only one who had been affected. Across the cabin, the other passengers who had witnessed the confrontation now looked at each other with a new understanding. A sense of solidarity seemed to fill the air, and though many were still quiet, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the event had united them in a shared experience, one that they would not soon forget. For Jenna, the encounter had been a rude awakening. And in her haste to assert control, she had acted out of prejudice, but the captain's intervention had forced her to confront her actions. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public, and the experience left her shaken. Toward its destination, she began to realize something. Her strength wasn't just in standing up for herself, it was in recognizing the people around her. The elderly man's intervention and the captain's leadership. These were reminders that, no matter how isolated we feel, we are always connected. We are never truly alone. The man who had stepped up to defend her earlier had shifted the course of the flight. Sarah felt indebted to him, but also empowered by his actions. She didn't have to fight alone. She never had to. At this moment, Sarah understood what it meant to stand together in the face of injustice. It was a reminder of how much power we have to help one another, even in the smallest of actions. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson she would take away from this experience. Together, we could make a difference. As the plane descended into its final approach, Sarah smiled faintly, her heart a little lighter than it had been hours ago. She was still pregnant, still facing the unknown challenges of motherhood, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was the world. As the captain's voice rang out through the cabin, Sarah's mind raced. This can't be happening. She felt exposed, trapped in a situation where she was powerless, her dignity hanging by a thread. The sudden intervention by the elderly man had given her a glimmer of hope. But now, with Jenna returning to the front of the plane, the sense of uncertainty grew heavier. It felt as though the storm wasn't over yet. Sarah tried to steady her breathing, fighting the rush of emotions that were threatening to overcome her. Her baby kicked gently in her belly, a small reminder that there was more at stake here than just her pride. But with every beat of her heart, the situation escalated. The flight attendants exchanged glances, whispers passing between them, but Jenna was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared behind the cockpit door. Everyone was waiting, silently, for some kind of resolution, but all Sarah could focus on was the feeling of humiliation crawling under her skin, too painful to ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant reappeared from the front of the plane. But this time, something was different. There was a subtle tension in the way Jenna walked down the aisle, her head slightly down, a stern expression barely hiding the frustration underneath. It was almost as if the entire plane had shifted in its gaze. Everyone was watching now, waiting for the next move. Jenna's eyes flicked to Sarah's seat, narrowing for a split second before she composed herself. Then, without a word, she turned to the elderly man who had stepped in earlier, the one who had defended Sarah. "Sir," she said with forced politeness, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. There will be no further disruptions." The man, his gaze unwavering, raised an eyebrow. "Disruptions? I believe I was simply standing up for what's right." His tone was calm but cutting, each word measured and deliberate. Jenna's face reddened, and she took a deep breath. "This is my flight. You're out of line." The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. Everyone on the plane seemed to be holding their breath, not knowing how this would unfold. Sarah felt her palms sweat as she watched the exchange. The reality of the situation hit her harder than ever. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something deeper, a personal attack on her very existence, something that had taken root within Jenna and poisoned her behavior. But the surprise twist came when the elderly man's words rang out, loud and clear. "I didn't step in for you because I thought I'd get applause. I did it because you've just been bullied in front of all of us. And if we let this go, that makes us complicit." Sarah felt her breath catch in her chest as she processed his words. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for what was right. His voice had shaken the air, and suddenly, everyone on the plane seemed to be looking at one another with new eyes, as if they were now collectively responsible for this injustice. Jenna was visibly shaken by the confrontation. "I'm just following protocol," she muttered under her breath, her previous composure starting to crumble. "Protocol?" The elderly man laughed bitterly. "If your protocol is to treat people like this, it's time to reconsider your job." The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The flight attendants had expected a quick resolution, but they hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. The moment had spiraled into something larger than either of them had imagined. She was a part of this fight. Just as Sarah thought the situation couldn't get any more intense, something unexpected happened. A passenger from the front of the plane stood up, one Sarah hadn't noticed before. He was a tall man in his early 40s, dressed in a designer suit. He was impeccably groomed, his face rigid, almost unreadable. He looked as though he had just come from a high-powered meeting and had been on his phone during the entire confrontation. But now, as he rose from his seat, his cold eyes locked onto Sarah's. "I'm sorry, but I can't sit by and watch this," the man said loudly, his voice cutting through the tension. Sarah's stomach dropped. She thought maybe he was about to speak in her defense, but what he said next made her heart race with dread. "Ma'am, I understand your situation," he began, his words casual but calculated. but you've caused a disruption that is affecting everyone else on the flight. There's no need to escalate things. We're just trying to get to our destination." The words felt like a slap across the face. It wasn't just his words. It was the coldness in his tone, the complete disregard for the situation, and the fact that he was taking Jenna's side. "Are you serious?" Sarah's voice broke through the silence, shaking with anger. "You're defending her?" The man smirked, not backing down. "I'm not defending anyone. I'm just saying that this doesn't have to be a scene. We've all got places to be." The betrayal was sharp, cutting through Sarah's resolve like a knife. This was the moment when she realized that this wasn't just about one flight attendant or one encounter. It was about the system, about how society perpetuates inequality, and how easily people could disregard injustice when it wasn't affecting them personally. It was a reminder that, even when standing up for what's right, there would always be those who would choose to stay quiet and let others suffer. The elderly man, seeing the gravity of the situation, stepped forward again. His voice, though calm, held a strength that cut through the growing chaos. "You're wrong," he said, addressing the man in the suit. "This isn't about convenience or disruption. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." The man in the suit scoffed and sat back down. But the damage was done. He had revealed his true colors, exposing just how indifferent some people could be to the struggles of others. In the chaos that followed, a woman from a few rows ahead stood up. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in simple clothes, her hair tied in a ponytail. Sarah had noticed her earlier, but she had assumed she was just another passenger. Now, as the woman made her way down the aisle, Sarah's breath caught. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice calm but strong. She turned to the elderly man. "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up, and I wanted to say, I'm with you." The woman's words hung in the air like a beacon of light amid the storm. Sarah looked at her, unsure of what was happening. The woman continued, her eyes now focused on Jenna. "Ma'am, you're not acting professionally. You've humiliated this woman, and I can't stay silent while that happens." Jenna's face turned pale. The passengers around her began to murmur, the support for Sarah growing louder with each passing second. The sense of unity among the passengers was palpable. One by one, people began to speak up, voicing their disapproval of Jenna's behavior and their condemnation of the discrimination that had taken place. This was the tipping point. What had begun as a quiet protest had now evolved into something bigger, a united front against injustice, a collective stand for equality. The flight attendants, once confident in their power, now felt the weight of the passengers' eyes on them. Jenna's expression shifted. She had no words left to defend herself. Her usual veneer of professionalism was cracking under pressure. For the first time since the confrontation began, she faltered. At that moment, the captain reappeared, walking swiftly down the aisle. His posture was commanding, his eyes sharp and focused. He had heard the commotion and had seen enough. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I've been briefed on what has transpired. I want to make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated on my aircraft." He turned to Jenna, who had gone rigid, her eyes wide. "You will report to the front immediately," he said firmly. "You're relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight." The entire cabin held its breath as Jenna turned and walked away, her face red with shame. The passengers who had once been silent now let out a collective sigh of relief, a wave of satisfaction rippling through the cabin. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the captain turned to her, his gaze softening. "Ma'am, I apologize for the distress this has caused. You're welcome to stay in your seat for the remainder of the flight, and I will personally ensure that this situation is handled appropriately." As the captain returned to the front of the plane, Sarah sank back into her seat, her body trembling with exhaustion. The ordeal had been exhausting and emotionally draining, but something had shifted in her. What had begun as an isolated confrontation had turned into a transformative moment, a collective stand against prejudice, a fight for fairness and dignity. The elderly man who had defended her sat back down and offered her a quiet smile. The woman who had spoken up earlier gave her a nod of encouragement. At that moment, Sarah realized that there were always people who would step up when it mattered most. It wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about recognizing that she wasn't alone, that the fight for justice was bigger than any single person. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, but the energy in the cabin was different. The passengers had bonded over this experience, and Sarah knew that, for the first time in a long while, the world had shown her the power of standing together. And when the plane finally touched down, Sarah was no longer just a woman trying to survive a challenging moment. She was someone who had learned to fight for what was right, to recognize the power of solidarity, and to never ever accept injustice quietly. She stepped off that plane, stronger than she had ever been. The aftermath of that flight became a defining moment for Sarah. What started as a painful, humiliating ordeal had transformed into a powerful realization. Her worth was not determined by the biases of others. The experience ignited a strength she hadn't fully recognized within herself. She was no longer just the pregnant woman seeking a quiet flight. She was someone who had fought for her dignity, someone who understood the power of standing up for herself. The support she received from the elderly man and the woman who spoke up had a lasting impact. They reminded Sarah that injustice could not be tolerated in silence. Her newfound confidence didn't just empower her to face future challenges, it pushed her to speak out for others. Sarah became an advocate for fairness, using her voice to help marginalized communities. The flight had shown her the power of solidarity. One person could be overlooked, but when others stand together, real change happens. It was a lesson she carried with her long after the flight. For Jenna, the impact was more internal. The confrontation had forced her to confront the prejudices she had been carrying unconsciously. The public reprimand from the captain had shaken her, but it was the conversations that followed that were transformative. Jenna sought counseling and began to actively work on understanding and unlearning her biases. She was uncomfortable with the realization that her actions had hurt others, but she didn't shy away from the responsibility. Jenna's journey wasn't easy, but she began to see how necessary it was to challenge her assumptions and make meaningful changes in her interactions with others. The flight had acted as a catalyst for both women's growth. Sarah's newfound voice inspired her to continue advocating for justice in her community, while Jenna's willingness to change showed that even those who perpetuate harm can learn and evolve. The moral takeaway from this story is clear. Change often comes when we refuse to accept injustice, and growth happens when we confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah's bravery reminded everyone on that plane of the importance of standing up, not just for oneself but for others. Jenna's transformation showed that biases can be unlearned, but only with effort, humility, and self-reflection. In the end, the story wasn't just about one woman's fight for a seat on a plane. It was about the power of solidarity, self-awareness, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Sarah stepped off that plane not just as a woman who had survived an ordeal, but as someone who had become stronger, more self-assured, and more determined to make a difference. The experience left a lasting impact on everyone involved. They came away with the realization that, no matter how small the act, standing up for what's right could spark meaningful change, both for individuals and entire communities. Thank you for watching. If you like the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. What would you do if you were in Sarah's shoes? I'd love to hear your thoughts.